absolutely ask those questions about how things are going to be looked after over the long term to establish them forever. Yes, they will be recycled and used and felled and replaced, but there's literally no point in investing in that tree planting in the first place if it's not going to be looked after for the long term.
The truth of the matter is, when you're talking about amenity trees and urban trees, we cannot just focus on an exclusively native palette. We need to diversify our tree species.
Welcome to the Society of the Environment EnvCast, where we feature special guests highlighting an environment top 5 each month. Each month, we welcome 2 environmental professionals to explore what they believe to be the top 5 things to consider within a particular topic. Topics range from climate to leadership, agriculture to AI, and everything in between. Look out for some curveballs in the top 5 each month, and remember, we can't cover every important thing within a topic. Our aim is to uncover how you can be part of the solution, to learn from the experts, and to sometimes think outside of the box as we strive for a sustainable future. Enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome back to EnvCast for another Environment Top 5, this time looking into the massive topic of trees. Trees have hit the headlines over recent years with planting targets to combat climate change, rainforest destruction, iconic trees being chopped down, oil palm plantations, and so much more. But where do trees fit into our collective efforts to protect and enhance our environment? What are the key things we need to be thinking about? As you'd expect, we are joined by 2 chartered environmentalists to discuss the top 5 things you should know about the topic of trees. But first, I'm Phil from the Society for the Environment and your podcast host for today. Our guest biographies are in the podcast description, but as an extremely short introduction, I'm joined by John Parker, Chief Executive at the Arboricultural Association, and Dougal Driver, CEO of Growing in Britain and Chair of the SocEnv board. So that's my chair and the Chief Exec of one of our very important member body partners. Very much time for me to behave myself. And with that in mind, let's get straight into it before I say something I probably shouldn't and hand over the mic to them so that they can say something they shouldn't instead. So, number 1, starting with the recognition of the arboriculture as a sector, and I'm handing it straight over to John. What should we be considering? But first, can you give us a bit of an introduction to yourself?
Sure thing. Hi, Phil. Thanks for that. My name indeed is John Parker. I'm the CEO at the Arboricultural Association. We are a charity and we're the professional membership organisation for people working in tree care or arboriculture all across the UK and also internationally. And you said in the introduction that trees have been high up the agenda for a few years. They have been. That's really good. We are very pleased, as you might imagine, that everybody's talking about how fantastic trees are. Somewhat frustratingly, people don't seem to have yet linked that to the fact that tree professionals are very important as well. So we hear lots about how trees need to be protected. We need to diversify tree species. Street trees are good for us. Trees do all these wonderful things. And it gets higher and higher up the political agenda. People talking about it all the time. And we keep thinking any minute now they're going to say, and there's a whole sector sitting behind that makes it possible. And that minute never comes, unfortunately. So we are still saying the same thing, really. I've been saying for years. Anyone who's heard me speaking for years might as well just skip through to Dougal's bits because I'm going to be saying the same thing as always. Arboriculture is the best career that nobody's ever heard of. If you want healthy, diverse amenity trees in our urban areas, then you need to have a strong arboricultural profession. And we at the Arb Association, but also lots of our partner organisations have been working towards that for years and continue to do so. And a key part of that is raising awareness of arboriculture, so that people see that it's a viable career for them to go into, but also so that we can make the case to budget holders and policymakers that arboriculture is a standalone sector. It has overlaps with horticulture in places, with forestry, with environmental professions generally, but it is a standalone sector, and it's something that people should be joining for a career. It's something that should be funded properly, and it's something that should be given the right level of political support.
Is there a why in your eyes currently into why it isn't being recognised so far? Kind of know why it should be. But
Yeah, why isn't it being recognised? I think that there's a problem with the word, with the terminology. I often bang on about this. The word arboriculture isn't necessarily easy for people to kind of get hold of, and you can compare it to forestry a bit. I think a lot of people don't know what silviculture is, but they know what forestry is. There's that sort of second tier word that people can get hold of. We don't really have that in arboriculture. The closest thing we've got is to talk about tree care, which is why we try and do that a bit more. And, the word arboriculture is important to us. That is our science and our profession. But tree care perhaps is easier terminology for people to kind of get a hold of. So it's not a word that people are familiar with. But also, it's just not something on the whole that young people particularly ever hear about. I'd never heard of arboriculture probably till I was about 26. I'd never knew that there was a possibility to work in amenity tree care. I'd have heard about forestry, for example. I'd have heard about gardening. I'd have heard about horticulture, but I never thought about arboriculture. And to many people, I think, probably to most people, trees in urban areas, and when we're talking about arboriculture, we're talking about amenity trees, so the trees on streets, in gardens, in parks, in schoolyards, in churchyards, all that sort of thing. There's a sort of they form part of the green background. That's it. They just kind of blur off into the background. They don't really think about the fact that somewhere on the line, someone has selected them, propagated them, planted them, done young tree maintenance, watering, pruning, and then inspections and surveys and pruning maintenance as they get older. It's not really thought about. So people love and celebrate tree planting and they love and celebrate ancient trees, but they rarely stop to think about those few centuries that sit between those 2 points.
Well, in good news, my 5-year-old has been learning about trees and planting trees and so on at school. So that's got to be a good start, but obviously there's a lot to know, right?
That is a good start, but the challenge I put down, it's wonderful that your 5-year-old's being told about trees and tree planting, but at any point during that lesson or during that session, were they told that there is actually a career to be had in trees? Because that's often the missing bit. Lots of organizations go out and spend great time planting trees with groups of school children. Absolutely wonderful. The children love it. They think it's fantastic, but at no point are they told it's actually a real job. And believe it or not, it's a real job.
Absolutely. That takes me back to my careers advice I had in secondary school, which was hilarious to think about now. I could have been a builder or an accountant. That is it. Nothing else.
They're the
Nothing else.
options.
They were the options. And I thought, that's interesting. I don't want to be either. So let's have a look at some other options, shall we? But that was outside of the careers advice. But never mind. Hopefully things are getting better in that sense. There's a lot of careers to cover, I suppose, but trees are obviously going to play a crucial role in the environment and the sustainable world that we're hoping for. Let's move on to point number 2, shall we? So we're talking about forestry in a crowded landscape. And what do we mean by that? Are we literally talking about crowded land here? And over to Dougal. But again, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, thanks, Phil. Yeah, so I'm a forester is how I normally introduce myself because I'm a chartered forester, but I'm also a chartered environmentalist, of course, through society, of which I'm honoured to chair for a little bit longer anyway, whilst you'll have me. And I think that's actually quite relevant introduction is that the Society of the Environment with its somewhat, let's say, 30 or so member organisations from across the environmental piece represent, best part of 10,000 members doing lots of different things. And actually, it links back to something John was saying about perhaps your sector, your particular initial profession not being necessarily understood. Being part of something like the society means you can speak a common language around certain things, and you can keep some of the stuff that, if I'm talking to a waste engineer or somebody who's really into the science of water and the environmental context, I don't need to know everything about, but there's that shared endeavor around enhancing, protecting the environment. So I think that's a really neat segue that sometimes it's what we share rather than the differences that really, really matter. And silviculture is the art of if managing trees together, if you like. So it's akin to often agriculture where you grow crops together in a field and you grow trees together in woodlands and plantations. So that's the sort of another subtle difference between what sort of John was talking about, although there is a massive overlap. And hence John and I work together really closely. We produce, like documents together. We want to make sure that urban, rural, individual trees, collections of trees, in towns, in cities, all these things matter, coming onto therefore the crowded landscape. So yeah, who doesn't love the green spaces in and around where we live? There's plenty of evidence to show that your well-being is enhanced if you can see trees from your window, for example. So it's literally not so much about, for me, food there and trees there and a national park over there and a wetland here. I think it's literally about these things working together. It is a crowded landscape. The UK government is consulting on land use at the moment because we need more houses. We have risks around food security. There's language around timber security. Timber's a commodity that's being used more and more as a regenerative, sustainable material to replace things like concrete and steel and plastic. So we need more of it. All the graphs are going up on how much food we're going to need. All the graphs are going up on how much timber we're going to need. Yeah, so very much a crowded landscape. And the issue is around, well, where's room for nature in all of that then? If we need to intensify the production of commodities, if timber and food is a commodity, I think the greater challenges there are with agriculture, because the more efficient you are in producing food, the perceived wisdom from that sector is to go down an intense route. And I say perceived because I don't believe it's the right way to go. And this might be controversial, but let's have a bit of controversy, because I know that sector is changing and people are doing some great stuff around regenerative farming, but it's not the norm. If you take a woodland and you manage it and you put light to the forest floor by thinning, our woods are largely underthinned. In the UK, 40% of our woods are undermanaged. If you manage that woodland to create more timber, you get light to the forest floor, you get more nature instantly. If you've ever seen a woodland that has been on your dog walk or as part of your sort of view from where you live, you will see that when work happens, it might seem quite disruptive to start with, but then the flowers bloom, the insects come, and the whole life cycle builds from there. Crops in a field are replaced by another crop in a field. And so I think there's a challenge around food security and timber security and nature for sure. But I'm pretty confident that good woodland management, good forest management set to standards, Growing Britain sets standards for good management, enhances nature at the same time.
So there's a lot to unpack there because there's a lot of potential people involved, I suppose, in decision making with a crowded landscape. What's the best way to go about that kind of those decisions that are made about land use and that kind of thing? It's a complicated web of opportunities.
Yeah, it's not. We're not making any more of it, are we? We're not, Phil. We're not making any more land. Last time I checked. So we need to think about what other proxy actions could take place to give space. So, do you know how much food waste there is in the UK every year? Anyone want to have a guess? 5 million tons? 4 million tons?
A lot.
A lot. It's between 6 and 10, depending on how you want to count million tons. If you translated that back through to the waste in the supply chain, potentially, that's food waste from once it's purchased. So if you then go back through the supply chain of where it's sold, where it's stored, where it's distributed, how it's grown and made in the first place, I suspect you're looking at a very high figure. And if you translate that to the area of land you might need to create, say, 10 million tons of food each year, you've got enough for redressing all of the loss of nature and for all your timber security needs. If you were to put that across to trees and nature, you would be way more food secure as well, because you could use a percentage of that lost land through waste to do that as well. So there's a way of combining things, but there's and making more of your land and managing the assets you've got, like I said about thinning woodlands. But you also could make a huge difference by reducing waste.
Absolutely. Can being a professional of any kind, as in being a chartered person, being a member of a professional body, that kind of thing, can that help with, let's say, influence to begin with? influencing those decisions to better the environment that in that space that you are discussing? Can it provide weight? Does it help?
I think it provides solutions because, I mean, there'll be knowledge in different sectors that can be translated across. So that, sort of technology, the use of drones or LiDAR or satellite technology, remote sensing, or the academia and science around agronomy, and can be shared across more, So I think there's definitely something about something like the Society of Environment, which has all these different disciplines where you can share skills and knowledge across and therefore gain on other sides. And I just think about unprofessional practice, as John was talking, actually, it's actually quite rare to find unprofessional practice in silviculture because it's not something that you can easily sort of knock on someone's door and do something, on the cheap for cash type of thing. But if you were to, speaking for John's sector for the moment there, it's something that blights his sector, is that someone can offer unprofessional services but seem professional to the unknown, aren't sure what they're purchasing. So I think, across the trees piece, I think it's absolutely essential to support professional, credible qualifications and skills and businesses.
Yeah, and it might help to have those conversations and join those dots to make correct decisions. Yeah. Number 3, diving into climate change in terms of species selection, peats and diseases and so on. I'm handing back over to John. Could you expand on the topic and what this means for the listener?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason we sort of talked about bringing this one up, sorry, I've got a dog sat on me. If anyone's using the visual side of this podcast, it's a dog that sat on me. I think we might be winning this battle now. I'm not entirely sure. I thought we've won it before, but there's often this perception that when planting trees, we should be looking to use native species. And there's often this perception that native species are best. And native species are brilliant. We love native species. I don't want anyone to accuse me of being anti-native species because they're wonderful. They have got great biodiversity benefits. We've got some wonderful cultural importance with our native trees. But the truth of the matter is, when you're talking about amenity trees and urban trees, we cannot just focus on an exclusively native palette. We need to diversify our tree species. And this is something that's been talked about and known about for a long time. It feels like we've won the debate and that we are diversifying our tree species. And then suddenly you'll start seeing people or organizations saying, no, it should be native. It should be native. We've got, depending on how you count them, we've got about 35 native species of tree, let's say, for argument's sake, in the UK. Probably only about, I don't know, less than a dozen of those have a really substantial canopy. We know that trees in urban areas bring lots of benefits, environmental benefits, social benefits, economic benefits. Collectively, sometimes we call them ecosystem services. And a lot of those ecosystem services are positively correlated to canopy size. So the bigger the canopy, the greater the benefit that we get. So we need big canopy trees. We need healthy trees. I'm talking about things like creating shade and, in some cases, carbon sequestration, rainfall interception, that sort of thing. And if we just rely on our native palette of trees, we're simply not going to get the canopy we need. We're not going to be climate proof for the future with a changing climate. The trees that were doing very well in Britain over the last few thousand years are not necessarily going to be doing well in the centuries to come. We also want to maximize our ecosystem services. We want to have a wide palette of trees so that they are doing different things at different times a year, whether it's with evergreens or whether it's, if we want to make them something just aesthetically pleasing, we want different kinds of blossom and flowers and bark and all that sort of thing. So we have to have a diverse species palette. Another reason being, you mentioned it in the intro about pests and diseases. If we put all our eggs in one basket with a very small number of native trees, we are really at risk of being very vulnerable to pests and diseases. We need to have as many different tree species as we can, really. We need to be having very diverse urban treescapes. We need to be creating arboretums out of our treescapes, really, in urban areas. If you look at a city like London, for example, London plane, not native, a very, very important tree to London. Too many London planes in London, you could argue. We are very open to pest and disease problems there. A lot of trees that some people think are native aren't native. Sycamore isn't native, horse chestnut isn't native, sweet chestnut isn't native, strawberry tree is native. Arbutus is native, but only to the south of Ireland. So is it native here where I'm sat in Gloucestershire? No, it's not. It's a bit of a pointless distinction a lot of the time anyway, and it's best if we just kind of ignore it, I think. Also, I would say there's sometimes some confusion around native and non-native trees. And I've said to people before, we should be planting non-native trees. And they said, but what about biosecurity? We need to think about biosecurity. And it's great that they think about biosecurity because it's a critically important topic that I'm sure Dougal will have more to say on later on through things like Grown in Britain. But it's not the case that native trees come from the UK and non-native trees are brought in from other countries. A lot of the time people seem to think that's the case. Most of the native trees we plant in the UK have probably been imported. It's not a matter of importing or not importing trees. And I would say as well, there's nothing wrong with importing trees. We need to import trees if we are going to hit the tree planting commitments that everybody seems to be making all the time. If we can grow it in Britain, that's obviously fantastic, but in reality, we're going to need to import trees. That's not the problem. The problem is importing trees from other countries without proper biosecurity checks and then planting them straight out into the landscape without any period of quarantine or any proper monitoring. That's how the pest and disease problems tend to get into the UK. We need to be following proper biosecurity controls. We need to be using nurseries such as Plant Healthy nurseries. We need to be looking at organisations like Grown in Britain, taking advice from organisations like the Arboricultural Association and, of course, SOCEMV as well. We need to be looking at this important issue and considering biosecurity whilst also creating a diverse tree stock for the future. Because everyone loves tree planting. Sorry, you're on one of the little hobby horses here. Everyone loves this tree planting. We're planting millions and millions and millions of trees at the moment. How many of the millions of trees that will be planted this year are going to be there in 200 years' time? I'm going to guess and say none. I reckon none of them will be here in 200 years' time.
Well, I wasn't expecting none. So that's quite a drop.
It's an easy thing for me to say because it's going to be hard for us to check. But I don't think there's a great future for a lot of them.
Yeah, they might not pull you up on it in 200 years' time. Yes, this is true. I feel like I've learned more about trees in the last 15, 20 minutes than I ever thought I would know about trees. So this is useful for me for a start. But on the native trees and that kind of thing and species selection, who has control over what gets planted in public spaces? And I suppose the secondary question, is that different to who should have control?
Well, that's a good question. So most local authorities will have a tree officer or should have a tree officer. I should say all local authorities should have a tree officer, properly resourced, several of them ideally. Not all local authorities do have tree officers. So that's a little rant in itself. But tree officers should be in control of what is being planted in the streets, for example, maybe in parks, perhaps, as part of the planning system through the tree preservation order system and what's going to go in to replace TPO trees that have been removed. Theoretically, in the public realm, the tree officer should have that kind of control. Often, I would suggest, well, how do I put this without upsetting anyone? I think that landscape architects plant more trees than arboriculturalists. And some landscape architects are absolutely marvellous and wonderful and go out of their way to learn as much as they can about trees before embarking on a sort of tree planting journey. Some landscape architects don't. And not enough arboriculture is taught on landscape architecture courses and landscape design courses. And sometimes you do see the same palette of about half a dozen trees being used and specified by landscape architects because they look a particular way. And we could do with more diversity being pursued not only by people working in arboriculture, but also in other related sectors too.
So that could result in a diversity-based problem.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We need to be thinking about the future. The thing with arboriculture, and I know it's similar in forestry as well, we're not fans of instant gratification really, or if we are, then we're very disappointed. The stuff we do now, we plant a tree now, you're not going to see the benefits of it for several years. You're not going to see it in its final form, perhaps for 50 years or 100 years. You've got to look that far in the future. And with a changing climate, with a complex picture of pests and diseases, it's quite difficult to predict what species it is we're going to need in the future. But some great research has been done. There was a report in London recently about future tree species there. TDAG have got some good resources too. This isn't something that people have to work out by themselves. There are resources out there, and of course, an entire profession of wonderful arboriculturalists to be called upon.
We'll put some of those links in the description. Dougal, you've been mentioned a couple of times in there. Did you want to mention anything about species and so on?
Yeah, well, I've just add for your to add to your links and references, ecological site classification, the ESC tables, which help just selection of tree species as well. I mean, the other aspect of climate resilience is, which I think John was touching on, is that we are planting a lot of trees at the moment, and drought and dry summers, long dry periods last year, several years, real struggle. Year before last, terrible, February to August. All this, so it's about being able to survive to give us those carbon and timber benefits as well as the nature benefits. So I just like to reinforce that and give you another reference there, which is really good from forest research. Yeah, that I could not agree more with the importance of being diverse and giving options for the future.
So don't just plan them, look after them, and try and prove John wrong about one surviving for 200 years' time. There's a challenge for someone.
We try and talk more about tree establishment now than tree planting. Planting's easy. Several years of work go on before you plant it. Decades or centuries of work going afterwards. So we need to stop obsessing with the 10 minutes in which we planted in the ground. It's about establishing trees and not just surviving, thriving into the future as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, on to topic number 4. Why certifications like Grown in Britain and Plant Healthy matter. Dougal, can you explain on this one?
Yeah, well, the segue here from climate resilience to Plant Healthy is that Plant Healthy certification is a biosecurity certification for organizations, not for the plant. As John pointed out earlier, rewind if you've only just joined this webcast. It's about the operation. It's about the overall biosecurity, not necessarily where things come from. And that's me saying it, as CEO of Grown in Britain. It's much more important that plants are biosecure because they sit cheek by jowl as the borders are, import, export. There's a lot going on. So we really want really good biosecurity practices. And that's what Plant Healthy does. Planthealthy.org. Go and have a look if you're anyway involved in the supply chain for plants, plant material. Most of the UK tree nurseries are Plant Healthy certified because it's mandated by the government for tree grants. And other sectors are being more and more coming into that scheme through government action and Plant Healthy action. On Grown in Britain, this is more about bringing our woods into management and reducing unnecessary imports. It's not about the fact that we import huge amounts of timber. It's about the fact that we're not as self-sufficient as we could be and use our woods better, use our timber better. We will always need to import material. Grown in Britain is a certification of sustainability and legality, but it's uniquely its provenance as well. So claims of homegrown don't really count for anything unless it's certified. You wouldn't have organic-ish carrots, would you? And you wouldn't do that with fair trade either. So why do it with homegrown timber? It's only homegrown timber if it's certified. And the reason that's important is, as I say, it's about getting our woods managed, but it's about adding value to local. And if you think about complex supply chains, you think about the world we're in at the moment. I mean, why are 40% of our woods undermanaged and we're relying on parts of the world to supply us with timber we could grow here and do grow here and don't even use? So we must plant productive woodlands, not just amenity woodlands where we can put productive species in. Let's mix it in there so that the future generations have got something to build their houses out of. And do I need to list what's going on in the world today? Let's just do a couple, shall we? One beginning with W, called war, which I hate to say so clearly out loud on a light-hearted EnvCast, but let's face it, we roll from one conflict to another that interrupts global supply chains. And then tariffs, trade, Brexit, pandemics.
That's more than two.
Jobs, local economy. Let's bring it back here a bit. Jobs, local economy, nature, pride in our landscapes, a thriving community, thriving rural communities. Why not invest in local? Why not invest in local supply chains? Think about where things come from. It's just a question of, it's not about, oh, I won't use so much timber. No, not at all. It's about, think about where things come from. And this might be controversial. Who knows what bots are monitoring this EnvCast? But you can buy things from certain parts of the world and feel relatively confident that it's come through a supply chain that you can trust. You can buy things from other parts of the world, and you might have reasons not to trust that. You may not go there on holiday because you're advised not to. It may be for other reasons. Just think about where things come from. Going back to food security, think about that as well. We've thought about it in the past about clothes. There was a bit of a crisis, wasn't there, about 15 years ago, was it, when it said, oh, where are your clothes coming from? Where are M&S children's clothes being made? And there was a whole examination about that. I think we need to think the same thing about timber products as well. There you go. I'm off the high horse now.
Well, I must admit, when you were talking now, I also thought about clothes in terms of where they come from and that kind of thing. So that was interesting that you thought about that as well. I must admit as well, I was watching TV the other night and I thought about Dougal and growing in Britain. I don't always do that. It was about timber and new houses. We've got, these big building targets for new houses in the UK. And Guy Martin, has anyone seen the Guy Martin program about passive houses and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
He obviously brought kind of standards of building to the TV screens recently, with the suggestions that kind of houses tend to be built for profit rather than quality. In terms of the environmental aspect, where does good sustainable timber fit into that? Because you mentioned house building. Sustainable timber is obviously useful for it.
Very much so.
Does it fit into the equation of mass building of houses at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's more timber in a house than you think. And in Scotland, they build massively more timber framed houses than they do south of the border. So, and there's no different. There's no difference. It's just attitude and tradition. And there are house builders and there are house builders. I'm certainly not going to fall into that trap of naming any, but there are some more willing to go the extra mile. It is about changing. It's about changing supply chains and looking under the bonnet and doing things differently. And not everybody wants to change when they've got a successful business model. I think it is down to planning authorities. It's down to organisations. Government departments build a lot as well. Some of the government departments are starting to specify more timber into their commercial frameworks, which is excellent to see. And some of them are focusing more towards, the things that would support homegrown as well. I think the private sector is good in parts, but it could do a lot more to encourage certified homegrown timber into its houses. Yeah, it could go up dramatically. And you only like I say, you only have to look north of the border to Scotland to see where it's been done much more widely and more comprehensively. And it is it's an amazing material. It's really versatile.
Okay, some really good key takeaways there. Look into what others are doing. See if they're using certified timber for their houses, that kind of thing. We're not just talking about houses here, obviously, but just an example given. Think about what those certifications mean, I guess, and think about what it means to whatever it is that you're building or producing. But we're going to move on to our final topic, which is number 5, which isn't really a topic. It's more of a key takeaway situation. So what do you want people to be really considering, having listened to this podcast so far? Who wants to go first?
Well, let's hit qualifications and professionalism first. I mean, if you're going to employ a service from somebody relating to trees, then you use the professional bodies such as the registers that exist with the Arboricultural Association and the Institute of Chartered Foresters and others. Growing in Britain has a directory, and use those bodies that you can trust. So if you want a career, as John was talking about careers, in forestry sense, the Royal Forestry Society is a really good way that other organisations in forestry have sort of deposited things that help your career and how you can develop those things. So SOCENV, Arbor Association, ICF, Grown in Britain, Royal Forestry Society. It's much better to do those things, go to their directories, than it is to just go on Facebook and look things up and see, find people who are shouting out their services, but with no professional backing.
Yeah. They're not just random badges of honor. They mean something. People have done things to warrant having these things after their names or certifications on their products, that kind of thing. John, anything from you?
I mean, I suppose I'll just reinforce that one first of all, which is that we sort of alluded to it earlier on, but arboriculture is an unregulated sector. So anybody can essentially buy a chainsaw and call themselves an arborist. There is no minimum levels of qualification required for that. As Dougal said, it's a bit different in a forestry scenario because you don't just go out and pretend to be a forester, but you can quite easily go out and pretend to be an arborist and knock on people's doors and trade as an arborist. So in that unregulated environment, professional standards, professional memberships are more important than ever, really. And obviously, the Arboricultural Association runs the approved contractor scheme and a few bits and pieces like that, which are very important, he says, plugging the organisation he works for. But the point is, that's all there really is out there to separate out all of those people who just buy chainsaws and go and do stuff without knowledge and the people who actually study. And as I said right at the beginning, one of the problems we've got in arboriculture is raising awareness and sort of, I suppose, almost a reputational thing. The people who go out with no knowledge, skills, or experience pruning trees are endangering themselves. They're damaging the trees and they're bringing our entire profession into disrepute because we don't look like a group of professionals. We look like a group of people who are just lopping bits off trees. So that's a major problem for us. And so I completely support the part that Dougal just said.
I've got another takeaway, Phil, if I can jump in.
You certainly can.
And that is to think about the long term. Again, it's picking up on something we talked about, not just planting a tree, walking away. Where you see someone saying, "Oh, buy this and we'll plant a tree for you," donate, plant a tree. I got to admit, I wonder what's going to happen to that tree. We have metrics in Grown in Britain that are 30 years minimum management to establish that woodland that John was talking about earlier. Establish that tree that gives so much back to wherever it is, whether it's in a street or it's in a forest. So do ask those questions. If you're involved in anything around tree planting, whether it's a corporate donation, a personal donation, or part of your professional life, absolutely ask those questions about how things are going to be looked after over the long term to establish them forever. Yes, they will be recycled and used and felled and replaced, but there's literally no point in investing in that tree planting in the first place if it's not going to be looked after for the long term.
Can I follow on from that, Phil? Again, sorry, but we've maybe moved past it a little bit now, but for many years it was all about these tree planting targets, just absurd tree planting promises that were coming out. I think we hit peak tree in like 2019 in the election when all the different parties were just outbidding each other on how many trees they were promising to plant, which was great because trees were on the agenda, but we didn't have enough trees in the country for what could have been planted with those promises. It is very easy for people to promise to plant lots of trees. It's not so easy to establish them and take them through to maturity. Unfortunately, young tree maintenance isn't very sexy. Nobody's got elected by saying, I'm going to properly mulch 10,000 trees this year. People like tree planting. We work with organisms that can live for hundreds of years, but we're forced into a political timescale. So no politician of any party really wants to say, well, I'm going to invest a load of money now and you'll really feel those benefits in 50 years' time, because that just doesn't fit in with the way that elections and politics works. So it really is about quality, it's about biosecurity, it's about species selection, and it's about care and aftercare, for the long term. And one little bit that we haven't mentioned, but I try and insert into anything I'm talking about at the moment, thinking about the idea of sort of green equity and who has access to the trees that we're planting, because we still see a lot of the time more trees get planted in wealthier areas, the nice, wealthy, leafy areas with the wealthy people in. They get more attention in the tree planting, in the aftercare. Those areas that aren't so affluent sometimes get left behind, and you can do all sorts of mapping, and there's maps available out there and lots of research to support the fact, of course, that trees do loads of good stuff for us, but those benefits are not equally distributed across society in terms of numbers, canopy cover, maintenance and care, survival rates, and all the benefits that flow from that. So we've got to think not only in the long term about how these trees are going to establish into the future, but who is actually benefiting from those trees and who has access to those trees and green spaces as well.
Which is all very useful to learn about, and mad to think that obviously that these trees get planted in more affluent areas when you consider the benefits that trees give, whether it comes to, shading your house so it doesn't overheat and that kind of thing. Everybody should enjoy that opportunity, shouldn't they, really? Okay, interesting. We've covered a lot there, haven't we? I had one main question. If somebody works for a large corporate organization, they want to make a difference in terms of trees, because it's been on the agenda. We've talked about that. But if certain organizations just plant trees for a certain amount of donation and those trees just don't last, is there any way you can point them towards where they can invest in meaningful long-term tree initiatives, whatever they might be?
Well, I'll take that. If I was an enormous corporate body with loads of money wanting to invest in a charity that's, say, focused on tree care and looking after the people who look after the trees, I would look no further than a sizable donation to the Arboricultural Association, a small, caring environmental charity that is dependent on membership subscriptions for survival. So please send it our way.
I feel like I walked into that one, but it worked
you really
out quite
did.
well.
I'm amazed you asked the question, but we'll see
if
it
there's
makes
if there's any loose change left from the sizable donation to the Arbor Association, then Growing in Britain will be there. I think it's a really interesting point, though, because I do think you need to look under the lid of what, say, the obvious donation points might be. And I think John and I have covered some of the things that really, really do matter, as opposed to, other things. And I'll give you an example of some of the things I would ask if I was a corporate. I mean, maybe, think about it, which is what we've said earlier. Think about where things come from. Think about, the rhetoric around, say, native or non-native, resilient or non-resilient. And one thing might be the two biggest threats to biodiversity in UK woodlands are squirrels and deer. And the way you control, we talked about pests and diseases. Well, pests, grey squirrels, not red squirrels. There are native grey squirrels. Keep the red squirrels out of areas, and they damage trees and they damage nation. They damage kind beyond anything you might imagine. The figures are huge. And we have 5 species of deer in this country, I think 3 of which aren't native, and they do huge amounts of damage as well. And this investment in tree planting is often munched away by deer. That's too many of. So if you're a corporate, you need to be asking those sorts of questions. And if you are, all people listening to this and corporates have families, and attitudes can change by perhaps understanding the damage that grey squirrels and non-native deer can do in this country at excessive numbers. So I think actually one takeaway from that would be, yes, obviously think about where your donations might go, but there's also messaging, attitude, information that can also make a huge difference, because there is quite a bit of misinformation about some of the things we've talked about today.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our guests today. As always, we have covered a lot. If you, the listener, have any thoughts on trees, tree health, forestry, silviculture, let us know in the YouTube comments. We're keen to keep this conversation going and join some dots where we can. And finally, please check out any links and resources in the pod description to keep on learning. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next episode next month for another topic to explore. If you've made it this far, please remember to subscribe wherever you're listening to this episode so you don't miss the next one. Also, rate our podcast and leave a comment to help us reach more people. Thank you very much for listening or watching on YouTube. We look forward to the next episode next month. See you then.